Thanks for inviting us. We're excited to talk to you all and, to talk about the Green New Deal even.
We're excited to talk to you also.
Great.
On that note, I'm going to jump right in and ask you all to imagine a world 50 years in the future where the Green New Deal, we have been successful building a Green New Deal, and what does the world look like?
I can kick us off. I think that there will be tens of millions of more people living in the United States, many of them not born here. I think the weather will be worse. Most of the extreme weather, a lot of extreme weather will be baked in. I think the response to it will be a lot better. Our everyday lives will be better. I think our work weeks will be shorter. Our leisure will be a lot more complex. The TikTok videos are going to be a lot better. And I think even though there will be a lot of tedium and struggle, I think that we'll move through the world with romance and adventure defining how we live our everyday lives, and not a sense of desperation and fear and precarity. And I'm pretty excited about that.
Did anyone else want to kind of comment on that?
Sure. Sorry, I was trying to unmute myself. So one thing, we try to start the book off with like a vision of a world 10 years in the future, which is not quite the 50 years into the future. But I think that the same sort of principles apply, which are that it's not going to be a perfect world. We know that, as Daniel's saying, we're going to have more extreme weather, more storms, more devastation from the climate change that's already baked into that we know we can expect from the amount of carbon we've already emitted. So it's not like the Green New Deal sort of creates a world where we don't have climate change, where we like solve climate change, or we don't have to deal with it for the rest of all of our lives. But we don't have to have that doesn't have to mean that people die in the ways that they have in the past. Thinking about something like Katrina as a model of a past disaster that doesn't have to look the same in the future, and that we can imagine a lot of other ways in which our lives are actually better. So Daniel mentioned working less, and having more time for what we talk about low carbon leisure, and we'll say more about that. More forms of not just belt tightening, lack of pinching consumption, but new forms of collective consumption. So, you can still go places, you can get around, but you do it by, electric bus that travels, from one city to another. You take the train across the country. You maybe take a cargo ship across the ocean. You move more slowly, and you don't have to be at work all the time. So you can actually do things like that make your life enjoyable, more time with your friends and family, and anyone else that you want to spend time with. Don't mean to circumscribe the people who are allowed to be in the sociality of eco-socialism. And in general, I think lives built more around collective forms of abundance and consumption, rather than the sort of, in some ways, the opposite of what we're all living now, like a very isolated and privatized life, which is not to say that's, this is sort of like the counterposition to the Green New Deal.
I'll just add one quick additional thing to those 2 points. I think another piece to think about, in addition to how our built environment and our everyday work lives would change in our leisure time and social relationships, is also thinking about how this would transform politics in a sort of feedback way. And we talk about this quite a bit in the conclusion to the book. But just to say it briefly, like, we know that public policies and public institutions also create constituencies, shape people's identities, and can create kind of enduring forms of political support to kind of lobby to continue and mobilize to continue for them to be expanded and continue to be enacted. So we imagine that, like, if Green New Deal, or once the Green New Deal is implemented, and over a sort of 50-year period, we could imagine people mobilizing for more green housing, for expansions of the renewable grid, for sort of kind of people being involved in politics because of the very ways that they've seen society and the built environment transform around them, and sort of reshape political identities and capacities in that way. And also the sort of piece that Alyssa was saying around freeing up our time also means time for leisure and pleasure, but it also means time politics and for fighting other battles after the Green New Deal is provisionally won.
The question that I have is, what is a critical aspect of the Green New Deal that people don't always think about, but is still really essential to the vision?
I can start. So behind me is the Karl Marx Hof, which has read Vienna's finest achievement, but I'm not going to talk about housing. That would be too easy. More and more, I would give the answer of a high school guidance counselor. I think the Green New Deal's green jobs vision in its fullness is about an insane number of essentially possible career choices for a 16-year-old with any learning style. Like if you are someone who likes to work with your hands and get them dirty, you could be building incredible no carbon homes or post offices or anything. You could be working in the woods, you could be restoring wetlands. If you're a big science geek, you could be coming up with forms of seasonal storage that make the landscapes even more resplendent. And I could go on. I just think the life course under a Green New Deal for a young person, whether they are a college person or a get out into the mountains person or anything else, everywhere where they would look and say, that is really interesting to me, I'd love to work on that and make things better, they will be able to make a good living doing that. It will not destroy and deplete them day in and day out, but will fill them with energy and excitement. And the more I think about the Green New Deal, the more I just think about that world of possibility opening up for people of all ages, but especially younger people who haven't started their careers yet. And I think that would be a nice thing to explain, or a nice thing to think about, the way that this changes the horizon of a whole life in the context of socialism.
Yeah, absolutely. I love the idea of having teenagers think about this as part of their future too. Alyssa and Thea, did you want to add to any of that?
I guess the sort of vision of what work is and what work does under the Green New Deal is one of the things we're really trying to reframe. And so thinking about both like how we can imagine something like care work being part of a Green New Deal rather than just sort of energy orientation. I mean, in general, I think actually it's like what a lot of the project of the book is trying to say, well, I think we actually do think of a very narrow set of things. When we think of the Green New Deal, we think of, jobs and green energy. We think of remaking the grid. We think of power, and those things are really important, but how do we think about all of the other things that go into how much power we use, why we need to use what we use energy for, and sort of and that how that is impacted by everything from what kinds of work we're doing and how sort of energy intensive those are, to the ways we get around, the ways we live, that there's this whole world sort of underneath and connected to, or I guess, I mean, the more like literal thing would be on top of and connected to the grid and to the sort of system of energy, but we just focus on the system of energy. And so actually I think, we see all of these pieces of it as essential, the housing, the transportation, all of those. But the thing, and the thing I was starting off with before I went off on the sort of like broadening of the vision is how to think about how that changes our vision of work in terms of what kind of work we do, but also doing less of it. And we all talked about sort of like more leisure time and less work in the opening. But I think that that's something that is particularly interesting to think about now as sort of our work patterns are being upended, and there's sort of this question of, well, how can we use this moment not to valorize like this is like some prefigurative Green New Deal, obviously not, but like how can we use moments of disruption to our daily lives to think about what other ways we might organize them.
I'll just add briefly that I think another thing that it might be a little more obvious or might not be depending on how one thinks about the Green New Deal previously, but I think something else that is another facet of the Green New Deal is just kind of this broader way that it might reorient our relationship to technology and to innovation, and kind of thinking about what it might mean to sort of put the public sector in more of a driving seat in terms of like how technology is produced, what types of technologies are produced, who has access to them, how equitable that access is, and thinking about how technology can be subjected to democratic governance more generally. And I think those are lessons that kind of go beyond like specifically like so-called green technology or clean technologies, but those are interesting sites to kind of start exploring those. And I think, just like the current state of the world, just reveals like the massive, I mean, I don't even like the term market failure, but I'm just going to use it for now because it kind of presumes that markets usually work, which they maybe don't. But there's just like this enormous market failure around like medical supply chains and who's getting the supplies that they need. Prior to that, there's and ongoing, there's an enormous market failure in terms of like clean and green technology. Is just like they exist, but they're not quite profitable yet because there isn't a market for them because governments haven't forced people to behave in ways that would involve the consumption of these technologies, right? So there's a whole like chicken and egg problem of relying on the private sector in the first place to produce these life-saving and planet-saving goods. And so instead we should just think about like, how can we innovate differently? And that relates back to Daniel's point around like encouraging all sorts of people to get into these sorts of fields that we need more humans to be involved in, but also sort of using public purchasing power and regulation to really direct what gets produced and under what terms and who benefits from that production.
To the point about 16-year-old job opportunities, I'm a teacher in my non-socialist organizing life, and I work with a lot of students who just like have talents, but for whatever reason they just can't do school because school can be like really hard sometimes. Like I know grown-up adults who probably couldn't do school, and it just really bums me out that we really do prescribe very narrow futures for our children, and the idea of broadening that is, I think, a really beautiful idea. So my question is a rapid fire question for all three of you. In a single sentence, it can be as long as you want it to be, but it has to be a complete, not a run-on sentence. In a single sentence, describe your vision for a Green New Deal.
Care for people on the earth.
I think that all the public amenities that we enjoy, from urban spaces to bus stations, to train stations, to housing complexes, to energy fields, will feel and look like temples of public luxury that don't cause environmental harm, but that bring us together and elevate our sense of the majesty of life.
Okay, so my definition is the Green New Deal will confront the climate crisis and the crisis of socioeconomic inequality at the same time and build a beautiful, eco-socialist, climate-safe future in their place.
Those are three great sentences.
Normally academia is the opposite of a lightning round, so we're trying very hard.
For maybe of those who are here tonight who haven't read your book, what are the 4 aspects of the Green New Deal that you discuss in A Planet to Win?
I will start us off with the first chapter and then leave it to my colleagues for the other 2 and maybe circle back to the 4th one. The first issue that we address in the first chapter is the need to dismantle the fossil fuel industry and kind of confront them head on both a political level and an economic level. So we see it very useful to kind of like drum up left populist rage against the fossil fuel industry since they're the main culprits globally for the crisis. And we also suggest a number of policies in terms of, first and foremost, keeping fossil fuels in the ground where they belong. So that's our kind of opening gambit, is like, let's get angry at the right people, not feel all a little bit equally guilty, but sort of like aim our rage in the right direction and force companies through various forms of regulation and nationalization to keep the toxic stuff in the ground where it belongs.
So we argue that part of the way that you confront industries like the fossil fuel industry, to confront fossil capital, you have to have a low carbon labor movement. And so we try to talk about how you actually build a low carbon labor movement and a few different pieces. And so one is, how do you justly transition workers who are in fossil fuel, the fossil fuel sector and sort of related industries into good, secure work in a way that can actually bring them on board to fight for a Green New Deal. We talk about the history of just transition programs and sort of how you can, whether Miners for Democracy, a coal miners organization in the 60s, or workers in the nuclear and chemical industries have envisioned a transition away from socially and from industries and kinds of work that are socially destructive and also harmful to workers themselves and their communities. And then we also try to broaden the vision of green jobs beyond the sort of, as I was saying briefly before, but beyond the sort of transition of people from like dirty energy to clean energy, and to think more broadly about the kinds of work that go into making good low carbon lives. And we say that low carbon care work is an important piece of that. And, you know, we'll talk about this a little bit more further on, but trying to think about how kinds of work that are good for people and planet, that are in my very short summary of the Green New Deal, caring for people and planet, can actually be a way to imagine both the kinds of green jobs that we need more of and that we can have people doing, but also like the bases of a labor movement that's out there fighting for the Green New Deal, since we've seen growing militancy amongst workers in those sectors in recent years, and there's a lot of political potential to be tapped there. So that as sort of the connected political piece to both fighting the fossil fuel industry, but also starting to build the world we want.
I think one of our main ideas that is distinctively eco-socialist in the broader Green New Deal terrain is the idea of raising the standards of living and the quality of life for most people around the world, but in a way that is much less resource intensive. That obviously requires class struggle, and Alyssa just laid out some of the contours of that. And in another chapter, we talk about the physical landscapes that are, I think, required for us to shift to a non-extractive relationship with the living world. And we go through a few elements of these systems. So an energy system, which sprawls across the country, but uses very efficient and nimble technologies so that we don't rely heavily on things like lithium battery storage, which require a huge amount of extraction. That energy system has to be tightly integrated into our housing system, which should obviously provide plentiful, extremely affordable, luxurious housing for all people, and it has to be retrofitted or built, you know, afresh. We need a transportation system that likewise moves us around, not just in cities, but also in suburbs and towns, and in indigenous nations. And we talk about what we're emphasizing is not the kind of technocratic fetish for raw population density, but rather a density of no carbon freedoms enabled by a much richer concept of what public transportation entails, including, for instance, you know, minivans run by worker cooperatives in regions where a massive public transit agency might not make sense. And finally, we talk about the physical transformation of landscapes that would create a far greater and richer set of possibilities for public recreation, with some inspiration from the New Deal, which actually poured a huge amount of resources into public recreation. Not always for the best reasons, but with some pretty exciting results. So again, kind of, we want a green stimulus, but it's also kind of like a last stimulus that creates the physical landscape that allows us for a very long time to live not resource intensive lives of freedom and collective freedom and collective enjoyment.
And the sort of final piece of the book in terms of the substantive chapters is, so Daniel and Alyssa just described sort of like the human labor and the built environment involved in transforming the world around us and living lower carbon and more democratic and egalitarian lives. And one of our concerns in this is thinking about all of the raw materials that might require, that will require. And as Daniel said, there are more and less resource intensive ways to kind of rebuild our built environment, but no matter how much we reduce our resource intensivity, there are raw materials required, right? So we kind of zoom out to the global as a way to think about what a globally just Green New Deal would look like, because a lot of these raw materials, some of them exist in the US, but not all of them do. And we don't have like an isolationist, autarkic vision of like everything needs to come from the US. We have instead a kind of internationalist vision of what would it look like to trade and cooperate and interact and encounter one another across borders without reproducing the deep inequalities and sort of neo-colonial structure of fossil capitalism, right? So the question is, you know, how do we all in the world, not just we in the US, like acquire what we need without relying on these pre-existing grooves of sort of trade relationships and supply chains that are highly unequal, both in terms of like who bears the costs of economic production, whose labor is super exploited, who deals with the contamination of extraction, but also who has access to the technologies that are produced as a result of these globally dispersed processes. So we make an argument for why we should think about democratizing these supply chains and how left-wing trade policies, which is something we don't talk about enough on the left, how left-wing trade policies might achieve that, but also how new kind of forms of transnational solidarity that look at the existing supply chains and mobilize kind of along with communities across them in order to target firms and corporations and governments that are violating, for example, indigenous rights or not protecting the environment in their extractive processes. So that we kind of give this broad vision of a globally just Green New Deal. And one last piece I'll say about this is just that, I think one of the kind of demobilizing aspects of climate politics, especially in the past, with this idea that like all the decisions are made in some international sphere where elites are meeting, like the Paris Accords, those types of things, and it doesn't really feel like an ordinary person could really get involved in that. And those international agreements are designed to exclude kind of democratic politics, but they're also designed to be completely ineffective. And so but we don't want to like kind of not deal with the obvious planetary and global parameters of the crisis. So we kind of use in a sort of materialist, from a materialist perspective, we look at the actual supply chains of how technologies like lithium batteries, like electric vehicles, like solar panels, all of these are actually produced, and think about both how to kind of restructure those supply chains in more democratic, environmentally sustainable ways, and also how with the way that they currently exist, which is not sustainable and profit oriented, we might organize across borders with other communities located at different points in these supply chains to make our voices heard.
So yeah, my question, this is the Public Power Hour. We're the NYC Ecosocialist Working Group. Our main campaign is a campaign for public power. It's a campaign we've been pushing for a little over a year now. And it's sometimes difficult to explain to people what public control of our energy system has to do with climate change. A lot of responses we sometimes get are like, well, why can't the private companies just decarbonize? So I wanted to ask you all, why is public control over our energy so important for a Green New Deal? And why does that sit at, in many ways, why does that idea sit at the center of your vision?
Thanks. It's a great question. And I'm like so excited about all of the utilities campaigns and also the ways that right now they're resonating with these broader demands around moratoria around utilities. And I think there's a lot of interesting action, political action there. Briefly, I think, first and foremost, one of the primary reasons to get privately owned utilities out of the picture is the way that for decades they've delayed action on moving towards clean energy. Like there's just like a long and sordid history of them at the state and municipal level undermining any attempt that states have attempted to set clean energy targets and move towards a just transition. So that's one thing, is their sort of political and lobbying role. And then, in addition to that political issue, there's another political issue, which is the way that they have captured regulators completely. And there's this kind of, I don't want to call it symbiotic because that makes it sound like it's good, but it's good for them, not good for us, which is that there's this kind of symbiotic or parasitic or whatever relationship between the regulators and the regulated. And that's one of the ways that they've delayed clean energy, but it's created a host of other issues around affordability and around like the inequalities that mark our energy system. And so that's another kind of getting them out of the picture would actually allow regulation to function better than it currently does. Another issue is the way that the profit and business model of shareholder-owned utilities kind of requires them, if they're going to make a profit, which of course they want to, and they are legally guaranteed a profit margin, it forces them to build a lot of capacity, because the only way that they can actually make money or make a profit above their expenditures is if they say that they're going to build a bunch of substations, transmission lines, whatever it is, or if they're vertically integrated, like straight up like energy generation and power plants, is say that they're going to do that and say that they need to raise rates in order to do that. That's just the profit model that exists. And it creates a lot of perverse incentives around overcapacity and also around locking us into a fossil fuel-based energy system, because otherwise it's a lot of stranded costs for them. So all of these, like the lobbying piece, the regulatory capture piece, and the profit model have just made private utilities like an impediment to the transition to clean energy. And then the last piece is like thinking about the the kind of mission and values of how we're going to transition into renewables, right? So like, even if some of those things I said previously weren't true, and for whatever reason, like private utilities were very enthusiastic about transitioning to clean energy, the question is like, who's going to pay the cost and who's going to make the decisions around how those costs are borne? And in my view, in our view, and everyone's view here, I assume, public ownership is just a way to make sure that that transition is actually just, that it's governed by principles of democracy and equity, and that the costs aren't borne by the lowest income ratepayers who are already living in energy poverty and having a lot of difficulty paying their utility bills in the first place. So I think just like removing the sort of middle person from the picture that is scraping profits out of our monthly utility bills, and an impediment to the transition is would be a way for that transition to actually be faster.
Alyssa sort of touched on briefly the importance of low carbon care workers in your vision, and I think we don't often associate care work with environmentalism in general or a Green New Deal specifically. And I know you've also sort of touched on changing how we think about jobs in this conversation, and so I'd like to hear you talk about how a Green New Deal would help bolster those kinds of jobs and how that would help us combat other public health crises like the one we're currently facing.
Yeah, it's a really important question in general, but I think right now it's obviously sort of very, coronavirus, like as disasters are wont to do, has laid bare a lot of the existing problems we have, and has, I think, really laid bare the existing crisis of care, which we write about some of the book, but like the lack of access to affordable healthcare, to elder care, to child care, to care of many different kinds for many different people, that I think is has two parts, which is one is access to care, and the other is the what I would say is a crisis of really bad care work, in the sense of bad work for care workers. So care work is really poorly paid for people like home health aides, or people who work in nursing homes, or for a lot of kinds of care workers, particularly sort of the lower down the low skill care work. I reject that distinction because obviously I think all care work is skilled work, but there are a lot of people who are doing really, essential work for very low wages under really poor conditions. We're starting to see, and I think right now is a very interesting moment where we're sort of seeing the gaps on both sides, where there's suddenly attention to the ways in which these, people are essential workers. They keep people literally alive day after day, and yet often work in worse conditions that are, their working conditions are sort of, to twist a little bit the usual like teachers slogan, like our working conditions are students' learning conditions, our working conditions are people's, living conditions. And we're seeing sort of the breakdown of both sides of that right now. And so I think that, the vision of care work as part of a Green New Deal is that this is work that makes people's lives better without intensifying resource use, or that is not inherently resource intensive. It can be. You can power a hospital on coal. We do need to change the energy system, but we also, there are a lot of ways to improve our quality of life, as Daniel was saying previously, without sort of constantly ratcheting up energy use and associating a better life with always higher quantities of resource and energy use. And so that's the vision. And so I think we can talk about this more, because I know that we're in sort of a tight time, but this, I think, is an important moment to be sort of pushing for all of this, and also I think to be highlighting the ways that that in our existing system, things like we have all of these things that we, I think, tend to I think we're seeing this in a lot of different dimensions. I've been mostly talking about medical care, but I think, the way that the question of whether you keep schools open is conditioned by whether or not people can, can you go to work if your kid's not in school? Can your kid eat if they're not in school? These are all questions that were on the table in the decision to close New York City public schools. And those are not the decisions we should be having on the table and thinking about public health. Like, people should be able to eat, have their kids taken care of if they do have to go to work for whatever reason, if they need to go to work because they're deemed an essential worker and they have to put bills, food on the table. I think there are a lot of those things we would want to totally transform through a Green New Deal. But I think that we can see how in a lot of ways we're not able to make decisions that are in the benefit of people's actual lives.
The coronavirus pandemic is going to reshape the world in ways that are hard to anticipate, which feels kind of exciting, but also really scary. What's giving you hope right now, and how can we grow that hope through our organizing?
I think what's giving me the most hope right now, and some of it's been referred to before, is just like the proliferation of really concrete, really politically well-timed and super like urgent social demands, just like around rent, around housing, around utilities, around medical care, around work conditions, around who's considered essential in terms of labor, and around migrant rights and prisoner rights and all these things. And it's not like all of them are going to be achieved just because they're being made, though they're actually having much more impact in the political sphere than I would have expected. And so I just think we're in this moment of openness and in a moment where the left is in a better position than it's been in previous years. And so there's this kind of confluence of things, and then plus a crisis. And so I think that people do have the language, do have the terms, and do have like the sort of radical horizons right now to demand what we deserve, rather than feel sort of like cowed or like sort of like in submission because things are too crazy.
To win, which is like a weak right and a strong left. And I think we might have in some ways both. My read is that socialism is really the strongest idea for people under 50. We might not have the majority, but I don't think there's another coherent idea that has more support than us. There aren't that many young, passionate Republicans. There aren't that many young, passionate liberal centrist technocrats, although they are currently doing very well with Joe Biden on Twitter right now. But so I think we have like a vision. Our program is in accord with what would essentially modernize an economy, although we want to make it much more democratic. We have a lot of momentum. I think if you look at where we are on the timeline of this decade, the decade of the Green New Deal, then we are very, very well positioned to win the arguments and to win the campaigns over the next like several years. And I wouldn't want to be like in any other camp right now rather than ours. And then this is almost, I think if you look at the possibility that Trump could have mobilized like a powerful right-wing populist kind of eco-fascist response to the coronavirus crisis, he hasn't. It doesn't seem like the right at this moment is seizing the initiative to provide answers to people's needs, but we are providing those answers. And so I feel that like with a huge momentum of organizing, with massive campaigns, and like SD was saying, practically every major sector of social life, with the best ideas to tackle the biggest crisis coming, the only people who will have something to say when climate crises converge with COVID here in the next few months, I think we are building a very, very powerful movement, and whatever happened in the primary can't take away from the intense momentum of our accumulating victories and the power that we're building. That gives me hope in a hard time.
I mean, what I have to say is I would think builds on both of those comments, which is just that, I mean, I will admit that it's not been the most hopeful time of my life. I've been up and down, but I do think the things that give me hope are seeing exactly what Thea and Daniel described. And I think realizing it's just so clear, not only as I was describing, the crisis of care, the ways that we rely on the labor of people who are treated like shit in this country, the ways that, some people have access, who are able to, shelter at home, and for other people don't have a home, they don't have a safe home, they don't have the money to sort of go out and buy a week's worth of quarantine food, that we're seeing laid bare all of these inequalities, but in a way where I think people are really talking about that, and realizing that there's something deeply wrong in this country, but also that we are also seeing how possible it is to do something. We saw the stimulus bill that passed a couple of weeks ago. It was not the stimulus bill we wanted. It was not a green stimulus at all, but it was the mobilization of $2 trillion worth of federal money over, like that. A huge amount. This is 3 times the stimulus from 2008. this is, you know, more money than Joe Biden was going to spend over 10 years on climate, you know, his Green New Deal. Like we can see that the money is there. The Fed can suddenly, you know, buy bonds for like every city, country in the world if they want to. Like we are seeing that actually there's a huge amount of federal capacity to both take care of people if the state should decide to do that, but also to take care of business if it decides to do that. And right now, I think it's sort of, you know, there's this sort of like trying to do both a little bit. But I think that we're sort of seeing that really clearly, and it's a real opportunity to say like, look, no, we need to spend this money. We can't just redo the stimulus of 2008, which you know, bailed out banks and did not bail out homeowners and people who lost their jobs and homes. And we actually need to, as we talk about in the book, instead of Obama said, you know, to the bankers, I'm going to protect you from the pitchforks, or like I'm the only thing standing between you and the pitchforks. We want to build the solar powered pitchfork factories and go after these assholes. And so I think like this is a real moment to do that and to say like, don't ever tell me how are you going to pay for it again. We know how we can pay for it.
Just to give folks a quick heads up, we're going to take some questions now in the chat, and I can just read them aloud.
Do you three have any projects you'd like to talk about that you're working on now? Yeah.
I'll mention one, which is the Homes Guarantee campaign. I just want to start with sort of like a circle back to last year. Last April, so basically a year ago this week, New York City voted for the Climate Mobilization Act. And there was a set of bills. And the most exciting one to me was a buildings energy bill. And on the floor of the city council, and I was there, Costa Constantinides, who's the city councilor, I guess he's running to be the borough president of Queens now. Not exactly an AOC type figure, but he said the reason we're passing this bill with the housing movement that made it possible is so that when mothers go to sleep at night, they are not terrified about their family being displaced by rising seas or by rising rents. And I think that kind of intersectional language about a climate bill would have been unheard of a couple of years ago. In fact, the New York City tried in 2009 to pass a buildings bill. The real estate industry shot them down. But 10 years later, with the housing movement and the DSA involved, they succeeded. And Pete Sikora, a good friend of mine who has led the organizing with NYCC, said to me, we couldn't have done this without DSA. And I think that's part of the answer as well to why this feels possible. Like, I'm part of this Homes Guarantee campaign. We're fighting to cancel rent. And we also have a huge Green New Deal intersection. And we know that groups like DSA are there hand in hand with us in a coalition of movements that didn't even exist a few years ago, and at a level of like where the climate justice abstraction has turned into a series of very, very, very real and concrete campaigns. And I know that, you know, DSA is there for any housing campaign in New York City, and that they're also there for any kind of climate campaign. The fact that this call is happening, I mean, I think that's where like the hope comes from. So I think you will all be on board for like the cancel rent campaign, and the fact that we're traveling back and forth between housing, social reproduction, climate, public ownership of utilities is something nobody could have imagined a few years ago. We were all around after Occupy Sandy, and we were not having this level of conversation or organizing.
I also might ask a question of my own if there's nothing in the chat, but I really appreciated, Thea, what you were saying about the way in which successful programs empower constituents as political actors as well. It's not a relationship of simply creating benefits. It's actually changing the political landscape upon which we're acting. And when we think about that, and we think about the model of the old New Deal, so much of the design and implementation of the old New Deal was incredibly racist and continues to have disproportionate representation and discrimination in some of the legacy institutions of the old New Deal. And so I'm really curious, what are some models that we would want to avoid, or models that we would want to emulate when we're thinking about that question of how we are politically empowering different constituencies with an eye on justice as we're building this?
I mean, I kind of want to like make this pivot back to housing and maybe ask Daniel to weigh on it too if he wants to. But it's definitely about being intentional from the outset about dismantling that legacy, right? And a lot of that legacy is literally built into our built environment in terms of like white flight and suburbia and highways and all of that, right? So like those are the literal the physical infrastructure that divides us by race and class, and was intentionally designed to do so. We, you know, have seen Kianga Yamada's Taylor's new book on that, and we also probably, some of us knew that some of the history beforehand. So, you know, I think that the way that we rebuild our environment can in a very literal sense undo some of that, and it won't be an easy process precisely because of the political constituencies that were created and that support the existing kind of system. But so yeah, I think that's one piece of it, and then much more targeted investments in poor and working class and racialized communities is another way to think about that. And then, you know, a couple of things that I'd add, and then I'll see if, you know, Dan wants to speak more on this, is just like the sort of green affordable housing, and just thinking about all of the multiple constituencies that would generate, from like the people that benefit from the apartments that are created, to the people that built those apartments, to the maintenance workers that maintain those apartments, and people that want to keep their jobs, want to keep their secure livelihoods and their secure places to live. All of those are now suddenly constituencies for that. But in addition, I think, and this goes to like something Alyssa was saying earlier about like social relationships and the way that our time and space is sort of organized to support certain social relationships, like the kind of housing that is behind Daniel's head right now, allows for certain forms of like neighborly interaction, and interaction with people that maybe don't live there but are visiting or passing through or whatever it is, and like actually has the sort of physical space, whether it's the parklets or the balconies or the patios or, you know, the lobbies, or having childcare sited in the building or whatever it is, like it actually opens up all this space for forms of social interaction that can cut across certain divides of gender, class, and race and ethnicity and native born or not, and bring people into sort of space of common identity with one another. And kind of, it's hard to overstate kind of how important that is, because we can see how much our given extremely segregated built environment has shored up very reactionary identities. So it would seem to follow that like the corollary is that restructuring our built environments in ways that prioritize social justice, prioritize social space, have feminist designs to them, racial justice, you know, in the whole equation, would actually create like different types of subjects, of political subjects and constituencies, as you were suggesting.
I'll just say briefly that we tried to think about how throughout the book, like every piece of like what we described has an element that is trying to build a different kind of coalition than the one that brought about the first New Deal. So for example, in the labor piece, like the original New Deal, you know, the labor protections we had in the original deal are often faulted for leaving out agricultural and domestic workers who were largely Black workers in the South, or that as being, you know, an omission of these workers so that Black workers in the South would not be protected. And that's, I mean, I really think that those kinds of workers are very much at like the forefront of what we see as like the Green New Deal labor coalition. Similarly, for something like attacking the fossil fuel industry, the communities that have been trying to fight fossil fuel infrastructure are both communities that are impacted by, disproportionately impacted by, you know, sightings of like coal-powered power plants, or like various kinds of, either by fossil fuel infrastructure or by the, you know, the disparate impacts of things like pollution on communities that we know are as a racialized and sort of class disparate phenomenon. And, you know, that actually we're seeing minimal or less pollution now, but with COVID, people who are exposed to even relatively small amounts of air pollution have a higher risk of dying from it. So like these things have repercussions in multiple directions, but those both community fights to shut down, you know, power plants, and also to indigenous fights to block fossil fuel development. You know, I think in every piece of it, there's actually a really different coalition coming into view than the one that built the original New Deal. And so the Green New Deal, we really don't want to signify like the New Deal again or like replaying the New Deal again. And it's important to think about that history. But I think in a lot of ways, it's just like it's a title for like a lot of really, really different kinds of things. And I mean, we can never ignore the history of racism in this country and the ways that that will permeate any kind of political project. But I think we're, you know, throughout the book trying to think of like how actually all of this is really, you know, the fact that I mean, climate change is a phenomenon that we know is going to disproportionately affect working class people, people of color, and the people who are in a position to fight fossil capital are already in many ways positioned to be at the forefront of a Green New Deal fight. That doesn't mean that that's not like a thing that we still have to think really seriously about and build coalitions around and all of this. But we were trying to think pretty seriously about that.
I think if I could just add to that and get at this question of how we win now, and even under Trump, or especially I think under a Biden administration, because I think under Trump it looks more like defense. But Thea and I and 9 others were involved in writing this letter calling for a green stimulus, which DSA endorsed. Thank you very much. Otherwise it wouldn't be meaningful. But the idea, the logic behind that letter was this, we're in a massive, massive crisis now. Over 22 million have filed for unemployment in the last 4 weeks. Everybody's crying out for help, hence trillions appearing out of thin air that used to not exist in public spending. And our view was, with what was happening in the primary a month ago and certainly now, we need to pivot away from the presidential primary or presidential race, which is a very efficient way to organize, but we have to pivot to Congress, which even if Bernie had won, was gonna have to write the stimulus anyway. I mean, if Bernie had won, there would be at best 1 progressive senator left in the Senate, maybe. And now there's going to be maybe 2+. So we need to organize, in our view, push the same coalitions that have gotten involved in national politics many times for the first time, like Socialists, really involved, like this group, stay involved in national politics with that multiracial coalition, fighting to diminish in a hegemonic strategy, the contrast between the squad and the non-squad, and using this crisis to say, if you are going to spend money, for the love of God, spend it on obvious green technologies that create jobs and put workers and communities in front, and pass policies that will visibly benefit workers and communities, unlike pouring money into places like research and development only, as under Obama, or under invisible forms of green improvement. So very visible, very big, very green, and built as much as possible from below. Thea mentioned the Green New Deal for public housing. We could talk about worker cooperatives and clean energy. We could talk about energy democracy, whole bunch of different things. And then we'll have to fight for the institutions. Our friend, the great Greek socialist and Marxist Nikos Plantzas, said that the state was the condensate of class struggle. I don't think Joe Biden is going to be a strong leadership White House, which means that the government will reflect the balance of forces. And we are one of those forces. And to the extent that we can tilt the balance in our favor, we can get a lot done. The decade of the Green New Deal is a decade. And we can get a lot done, I think, in the next year or 2 with green stimulus that will put us on the path to be able to say, actually, you thought that socialism wasn't electable in 2020. You agreed with every one of our policy platforms. We just didn't think it could be realized. Well, we just achieved 1/5, 1/4 of that agenda. Now let's go for the rest of it in 2024 in the White House. So I think there is so much to fight for, many wins that we can win in the short term, that if we're smart about those wins, can build the momentum and the visibility and the argument and the immediate material benefits that will make it so much easier to win bigger and better in the years ahead. So it's not ideal, but it's not the opposite either. I think we have a lot, we have a strong foundation to work from.
And
well, thank you. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, just really briefly, I think it's especially, we really need to not think of the Green New Deal as a thing we like win or don't win. It's a thing that we win in pieces over and over for, this is definitely over the decade of the Green New Deal, but even beyond that, like this is not like a one and done piece of legislation. And if we think about that, we're going to lose. So I think it's like, what can we do within a less than ideal situation? Like we talk about in the beginning, the best case scenario, we're not in the best case scenario. Hopefully we won't be in the worst case scenario. But in every scenario, we sort of close out, we start with the sort of best case scenario, but at the end, we try to close out with a vision of like, well, it's all out, not all or nothing is sort of how we phrase it. It's an all out fight. You really have to keep fighting really hard, but it's not like you lose one piece of it or you don't get all of it at once and it's over, because we just can't think that way. It's like, it's going to be partial and kind of uneven and ongoing. But, I think Daniel's right that there's a lot we can do under Biden in particular. And even under Trump administration, we're going to have to figure something out.
Well, we are at the top of the hour, and I just want to say again how incredibly grateful we are to all 3 of you for joining and for this really robust discussion. And we'll definitely be following back up. I just want to say again, thank you so much for joining us tonight, and we'll take a quick break. So Thank you so much.
This was
Thank you
awesome.
so much.
Patrick, you've been organizing in
great
space
questions.
since we met during Occupy Wall Street. And
That is
organizing
true.
creates the things that we write down on our pages, you and the rest of you. So it's, it's an honor to speak with you all.
Well, thank you so much, Daniel. Always good to see you. Take care, all.
Likewise.
Okay,
Cheers.
bye. Thank you.
Thank you
Have
so
a great meeting, 101 session. Anyway, bye.
Bye.